Okay, so welcome everybody to this talk organized by the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. My name is Marco Antoncic. I'm the convener of LUNN, and it's my pleasure today to host our two speakers, Professor Maya Tudor and Professor Harris Mylonas. Maya Tudor is Associate Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Oxford, and she has written extensively on the origins of, sorry, I'm closing the transcript because people don't need to see the transcript, I guess. She has written extensively on the origins of effective and democratic states with a regional focus on South Asia. And she's also a regular contributor to various non-academic outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, and more. Professor Harris Mylonas is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at Georgetown University, and is also the editor-in-chief of the academic international journal Nationalities papers. His research focuses on state management of diversity, associated with national minorities, immigrants, refugees, and diasporas, and is also the author of the award-winning book, The Varieties of National Building. And together with Maya, they recently published the book Varieties of Nationalism, which was published by Cambridge University Press, and this is the book they are going to present today for us. So they would be talking for about maybe less than 30 minutes. I would invite everybody, please, to close the cameras and to close their own microphones, and there will be time later on to ask questions. The talk is going to be recorded and later on posted on the LUNN website, so please be aware that this seminar is indeed recorded. So I'm passing the microphone to Maya and Harris, and closing my...
Since it's recorded, let me just say I'm from the other George Washington University, North Georgetown, not the King.
Sorry.
Just
for the record, thank you very much. Thank you very much for correcting this information. So I'm going to close the microphone. I'm going to close my camera as well. And yeah, we're going to see you later again. Thank you.
All right, Marco, thank you so much for having me. And Harris and I really hope it's an opportunity to have a conversation about your questions on this book. And Harris and I got together and wrote an article that was the precursor to this book. And that article was called Nationalism, What We Know and What We Still Need to Know. And that was an effort to really chart out the lay of the land when it came to the study of nationalism. And part of the reason we needed to do that was because there's both a temporal change in the study of nationalism as well as a disciplinary diffusion in the study of nationalism. So I'll take those in turn. There's much of the early research on nationalism, as all of you who are part of this network will already know, ask the questions about where nationalism came from. So what explains the rise of nationalism as the kind of preeminent identity in the modern world? There's been a great kind of flowering of that kind of research. But newer research has asked much more about the consequences of nationalism. And so as that kind of focus in nationalist studies was happening, we realized that it was kind of important to take account of what various scholarly approaches to nationalism had done. Harris, if you can move to the next slide. And part of the reason for also a book that looked at the state of nationalism scholarship was, as you can see in the graph before you, that there are other objects of study, particularly in the field of political science, where both Harris and I come from, that have had actually a great deal of that have received a great deal of scholarly attention. So this is a Google, a graph from Google Analytics looking at the published articles over time, looking at concepts such as state, wars, parties, democracy, and nationalism. And as you can see, nationalism was pretty low. It's still comparatively very low. It's also on the rise, however, I think for reasons that that we can talk about. There was, of course, a kind of period that we, at the post-World War II period, where there was a recognition or a thought that nationalism had been rejected. In Albert Einstein's words, it was the measles of mankind. And it was forgotten about really in a lot of political science scholarship until scholars began to look more closely at the consequences of nationalism after the Soviet Union disintegrated. Famously, of course, Frank Fukuyama said, "We're living at a time that is the end of history." And history means, the end of competition over forms of government, that kind of liberal democracy had prevailed, and a liberal democracy that didn't really recognize identities. It's perhaps a sign of the times that his last book is called Identity, that in fact identities, of course, didn't go away and have been continued to be very, very important as forces in shaping world politics. But even as the study of nationalism has risen, it's unlike the study of the state or of war or of democracy. The study of nationalism is also split between disciplines. So social psychology, anthropology, political science, sociology. These are all fields that look at nationalism, and they look at them with different canonical backgrounds and different kinds of methods. And so we thought, again, this is all a way of saying that there was a place and a space for a book that tried to integrate what nationalism scholarship was at the broadest level saying. Next slide, please, Harris. So what does the book do? The book says, and it's just come out this July, it says that a nation is, much of the scholarship agrees on that a nation is a type of a social identity, and it's a type of identity that definitionally aspires to some degree of political self-rule over a distinct territory. So there's a lot of conceptual stretching in political science, and if you look at the top Google searches or for studies of nationalism, they'll often stretch in ways that aren't actually sometimes consistent with these two terms or these two definitions. So, for example, Bavarians in Germany have a sense of identity, but because there's no serious proportion of the Bavarian elite that just aim for political self-rule, it's not really Bavarian nationalism, but a Bavarian identity. So if that is a nation, then nationalism, which Harris, next slide, please, entails a broad intersubjective recognition of an imagined community of people as a locus of loyalty and of solidarity. So as Anderson, among others, have said, with this idea of imagined community, is intersubjective. It's recognized between people, and it is a form, an entity that is a form of a locus of loyalty. The second is that nationalism entails the desire for some degree of self-rule over a distinct territory, and often a substantial proportion of either the elite or the people that are pushing for greater autonomy, if not full political independence. And third, as Michael Billig has particularly been a path-breaking scholar on, it also often in daily forms entails a repertoire of symbols and practices that embody and celebrate this community. And that ranges from high culture, things like monuments and museums, kind of everyday festivals, holidays, the images on the currency, and such like. Next slide, please, Harris. Actually, I think this is you, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
So I'll pass over to you.
Yeah. Well, so thank you, Maya, for starting us off with such a wonderful introduction. So the collaboration started, as we said, with this more synthetic review understanding, but then we both decided that we needed to do a bit more for the book, for the element. And in the book, the first quote, so to speak, for those of you who have downloaded it or who bought it, you'll see it starts with this brief description of the well-known story of the blindfolded monks that are holding different parts of an elephant. And in a way, in our effort to speak about what we think was, I guess, not going great in some areas of nationalism studies, the bickering, let's say, that sometimes takes place about whether we're all studying the same thing, is a result, we think, sometimes of the different questions that different people are interested in. So we try to distill these three questions in the book, and in the slide you see now the first question, which basically is, does a nation or a national community exist? And here we focus on the first two dimensions of nationalism along which this question varies, or that actually produce variation in this question, let's say, a late fragmentation and popular fragmentation. And these can actually, both of these can vary at the same time. Of course, you can have high late fragmentation and low popular fragmentation and vice versa, or you can have both of them co-varying. An example we give in the book comes from the Yugoslav national idea, which definitely existed and was propagated or more or less promoted, let's say, by the government, definitely through the 1980s, after World War II. But in the 1990s, we see that the Yugoslav national community has completely fragmented, both among elites and everyday citizens or the public. And other national identities and national communities basically take the space that was the Yugoslavian nationalism was at least aspiring to fill that space. Moving on beyond the first question, which also kind of logically and chronologically comes first, is there a national community? The second question that is important, I jumped fast to the third slide. The second question that we focused on was, how do national narratives vary? So once we have a national community, it goes without saying, given the definitions we gave you earlier, that it will have some type of national narrative, but that national narrative could be more or less ascriptive. It could also be more or less thick. And the example we give to fix ideas in the book comes from the founding of India, and basically pointing out that India's national narrative at the founding was relatively unascriptive, because the Indian nation was not defined through the fixed identities of race, religion, and ethnicity, whereas neighboring Pakistan, that Maya is going to talk about in a few minutes, had its national identity much more anchored and defined by Islam. Also, I mentioned thickness. National communities can also vary in terms of thickness, in the sense of how many markers like geography, language, and culture may define a nation. We give the example there of France, which basically it had a single shared national language, could be seen as having a thicker national identity than neighboring Switzerland, which doesn't have one official national language, but more than one. So you can also think about it as layers, but that's an example that we use to fix ideas. The third and final question I'm going to talk about is, once you have actually a national community, has a national narrative, the next question that is important to ask is, does that narrative matter? Does that national identity matter for the individual that belongs to that group? And that the dimension that we focus on here, of course, you can focus on many other dimensions, as we say in the book, but we focus on the dimension of salience. And that's a very well studied dimension. And we highlight it because obviously it's a very important dimension to understand how important an identity, a national identity, is relative to other identities. So especially when it comes to making or capturing whether a national identity is more important than tribal or subnational or even supranational identities, like being a European Union member or having a European identity, let's say. So that's the third and last question we're thinking as a very important question, that together all these three questions make up the elephant that is nationalism in our view. Now, to fix ideas even further and to help us go through this exercise, Maya is going to talk about a particular example we unpack in the book. The book, again, as we said, is not as empirically heavy, but it's more theoretical framework that others can take and apply to various cases around the world. And this is the case of Pakistan. So the floor is yours.
Great. Harris, can you just go back to the example? Because I want to just give a bit of background. Great. So for those of you who don't know the context of South Asia, British India, the British colony of India, is comprised of today, what was comprised of the modern day states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. So it's a big behemoth. And the Indian nationalist movement, which Harris alluded to, was actually really quite different from the Pakistan nationalist movement. But I have to just tell you a bit about that so you understand the difference between the Indian and Pakistan and how that illustrates some of these dimensions that we lay out in the book. So the Indian nationalist movement begins in 1885. So it is quite an old movement. And by the time Indian independence arrives in 1947, there's been a mass phase of Indian nationalism involving marches and boycotts and such like over a period of 3 decades. So it's really quite a robust nationalist movement, both in many of the dimensions. There's, because of the mobilization, there's not a lot of elite and popular fragmentation. There's a fair degree of thickness, and it's become highly salient over a long period of time. As Harris already mentioned, it's not particularly ascriptive. So that gives you a sense of India. Now, the Pakistan nationalist movement was first founded in 1906, but it was a movement that wasn't really active until 1936, 1937. So just a decade before independence. There was a movement led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which said, we, the Muslims of South Asia, constitute a nation. So they kind of borrowed this language of nationalism and soldered together what were really an incredibly diverse, geographically diverse, socioeconomically diverse group of individuals patchworked across this vast subcontinent of British India into the community, the Pakistan nationalist movement. And Pakistan is actually an acronym, so it stands for Punjab, Assam, Kashmir, and Stan means state. So even the name represents kind of this hodgepodge of peoples that came together. Okay, next slide, Harris. So in 1947, when Pakistan achieved independence, the movement did achieve a low degree of fragmentation among elites and popular kind of popular segments of the population, because the rallying cry for a nation which was achieved was actually Islam in danger. And so the idea of Pakistan was from the start very closely tied to Islam, which is why there was a high, as we say, a high degree of ascriptiveness. Pakistan's identity was closely fused with Islam. But at the same time as it was highly ascriptive, it was actually low in terms of thickness. So when you say to be a X, to be a Pakistani means, what does that mean? How many things can you put in that box? There wasn't language. There weren't even shared borders because there were two wings of the country, East and West Pakistan. There wasn't a shared ethnicity. So the only thing that really held these diverse groups and diverse geographic areas together was this idea of Islam in danger. So it was high ascriptive, but low thickness. And because Islam had been mobilized to create the state of Pakistan, it was, of course, at the time of independence in 1947, a highly salient national identity. Next slide, please, Harris. So this begins to change because if you can imagine sort of almost an inverted triangle that is British India, the wings, the top heavy parts of the triangle are respectively West and East Pakistan. And these two wings of the country have trouble over the progressive 2 decades, creating a national identity or creating a power sharing compromise. And over time, the West and the East solidify into these antagonistic camps for reasons I can talk about in greater depth if there's interest. But suffice it to say, there becomes progressively over the next 2 decades between independence in 1947 and the late 1960s, a high degree of fragmentation among elites about what the national language should be, about how power should be accorded to these wings, and what, in fact, the very idea of Pakistan represents. And there's also correspondingly a fair degree of fragmentation among the popular sectors about similarly what Pakistan means and what the national identity entails. West Pakistan's narrative is highly ascriptive. It is really still focused on Islam because there are West Pakistan itself has multiple regions within it. And those regions, all again, they share in common is Islam. So there's still a highly ascriptive national identity, but it continues to be quite thinly articulated. Again, there's no shared language. There begin to be fights over Sunni and Shia interpretations of Islam and such like. And there's still a medium salience of the national identity. In East Pakistan, what eventually becomes Bangladesh, however, there's this kind of medium ascriptiveness because Islam has not served to solder together the East and the West. And so this group begins to think of itself as not, or less and less of Pakistan and more people who speak Bangla, who are also Islamic, but language assumes greater importance in defining the national identity there. And so it becomes less ascriptive. And because Bangla is mobilized for this, what is increasingly a nationalist movement, it also takes on forms of thickness with literature and poetry and festivals that are associated with East Pakistan. And that leads, of course, next slide, please, Harris, by 1971 to East Pakistan declaring its independence and becoming the new state of Bangladesh. And then again, because this new state is carved out, it again changes these 5 variables or dimensions or varieties of nationalism that we talk about. In the aftermath of a war or a nationalist movement, oftentimes elites and popular sectors come together. So there's low elite and popular fragmentation in both of these countries as a result. And for reasons I've already talked about, there continues to be high ascriptiveness and low thickness in West Pakistan, which is now just Pakistan, and formerly East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. The nature or the building blocks of the national identity have changed. And in both countries, because a war or a genocide, depending on your perspective, has just been fought, both of these identities have a high salience. So I think that's our last slide, is it not, Harris?
Yeah. So yes. Just to add to this, not to the case, but basically once we go through this framework and we unpack some of these cases, illustrative cases, obviously we don't do any new research for these particular cases. We build on existing research we've either done ourselves or other scholars. We then draw the point that was implied that studying these different questions and focusing on these dimensions that we just talked about has clear policy implications, that basically variation in these dimensions can be clearly linked to political consequences. Obviously, for the first question, does a nation exist? Does a national community exist? The implication of high fragmentation at both elite and popular levels means that that identity ceases to exist or to mobilize, in other words, people. And when it comes to issues that have to do with divergence of, divergence of elite and popular fragmentation, you can have a popular uprising, for example, against the elites if the public disagrees with their view of the national community, and so on and so forth. So basically, a lot of these theoretical constructs we're discussing and dimensions can be very clearly linked to clear consequences like getting something done, solving a collective action problem, keeping a community together or not, or succumbing to a secessionist movement or to going into a civil war, and so on and so forth. So we don't obviously test all this, but we draw those linkages. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you, Harris. It's great to hear a synopsis. I guess it was very obviously given the time you were given, but now opening the floor to any question and comments the people might have. They can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and then ideally, if you have a camera, you can also open the camera, or if not, just the microphone. But either way, please, that's the time. If you have any comments, questions, curiosity, anything that you want to ask.
It's better to see faces, I would say.
Sorry?
It's better to see people's faces, I would say, if they don't have any
absolutely.
conflict.
Yeah, if people are happy to open the cameras, please do open your own cameras. Maybe while people are thinking about questions or comments, let me maybe, as a way of breaking the ice, let me start again. More maybe on the theoretical side, maybe more on the introduction that you made about what is a nation, etc. And coming more from an approach that engages with everyday nation, I would be curious to understand how do you see the relationship between the elites and the everyday people? Because the way you define the nation as a social identity, but then when you ask the question, does the nation exist, you go down to narratives. And so the nation becomes a narrative at the end of the day, but whose narrative? And so who does produce that narrative? I'm expecting from your perspective would be the elites, the political elites. somehow, but this leaves out somehow the people that, in a sense, you explicitly brought them in when you talk about Michael Billig and that sense of more banal nationalism. But it doesn't really seem that later on that ordinary people enters the nation in terms of maybe the reproduction, not necessarily the production, but the reproduction of the nation in the everyday life. And particularly given maybe the work of Harris, also in relation to refugees, diaspora, etc., I wonder to what extent we can really think about the nation as a narrative when we visit. I mean, how many narratives of nation are we coming about when we have so many diverse people within the nation? And so, yeah, these are some of the points that resonate with me when, yeah, when you present your talk. Like, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Harris, do you mind if I start on that one and then pass over to you? Okay, so I think that that's just a really wonderful question, Marco. And I think one of the things that the empirical examples we talked about brought out is actually the close relationship between elite and popular narratives, particularly in the moments of change. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a causal, that the causality can't go both ways. So the way that I conceptualize it is that at these founding moments in particular, particularly in the post-colonial countries that I study, where elites still have, compared to Europe at the same point in time, just an enormous influence, social, political, and economic, over kind of subordinate social groups, that they sort of decide who and what the nation is represented by. And there are certain historical figures, certain stories, certain narratives of things like wars and colonial struggles that get told and then put into history books, into festivals that are celebrated, and so forth. So there's a kind of transmission belt from who represents the nation, and I think at founding moments, that transmission belt is more likely to be, substantially more likely to be in post-colonial countries, going from elites to kind of everyday people. But that doesn't mean there aren't moments where the reverse can't happen. So even in the context of India, you have the moment within a decade or two of independence, you have mass mobilization from non-elites on the basis of language. And despite an enormous amount of political control over India, the nationalist movement, which is the Congress Party, is forced to accede a very major policy change on something that they don't agree, which actually changes the nature of the nation. That is states that are set up according to language. And I think you can think in lots of countries that there are moments where there are movements by masses that are not traditionally, at least by people who are not traditionally understood as elites, who then become elite in some sense by virtue of their success. And then those narratives are taken up into what are elite narratives. So I think that there are some interesting mechanisms of interaction and pathways between elites and masses, but it's not a surprise that they tend to move together. Harris, over to you.
I'll be brief because we have a couple of more questions coming up. But well, yeah, I agree with Maya. More technically speaking, in a way, the individual, not necessarily the everyday nationalism perspective, but the individual exists in every level, right? So in the question, does a nation exist? It's represented in the public fragmentation, right? The public includes, it's made up of multiple individuals, sometimes in groups, sometimes individuals who are trying to create a group, right? And then in the third question is 100% at the individual level. Salience refers to the salience, especially the research we're quoting and synthesizing from or building on, in the book is individual level survey kind of research on salience. And there is a ton building on social psychology that we can talk about. But it's, again, not the everyday nationalism. I think Maya answered more in the everyday nationalism perspective that you were interested in. But we shouldn't conflate the everyday nationalism perspective with the individual perspective, because there's an approach to studying nationalism at the individual level that has nothing to do with the everyday nationalism perspective. And that's yet another, if you want, contribution of our book, is to clarify that. And instead of having a gladiator kind of fight, or a lions, arena with lions kind of fight about which one is the best way, is to clarify what different people are doing and what context or what type of questions different research programs are answering. We're not taking sides here saying, oh, it's better to do everyday nationalism or it's better to do survey experiments. We're saying here's different things that different people are studying that all fall under these rubrics.
Thank you both. I see Ronnie and then Daniel. Do you want to take both questions together, or let's see how it goes? Ronnie, if you want to open the camera, it's fine. If you want, it's up to you. Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for that. Thanks both for the presentation. It was very clear and very graphic. And thanks also to Marco, because he included me in the mailing list, and now I can come to the seminars. So I just wanted to ask, following up on a bit on what you were talking about already, I just wanted to ask if you could talk a bit more about how elite fragmentation is measured, because you've talked a bit about fragmentation at the social level. You talked about, for instance, you were talking in Bangladesh in terms of the completely different prevalence of language and how this is built into a different cultural milieu and whatever. And I wanted to see if you could talk more about how you define elites, like what sectors of society are you looking at, how you define and how you define fragmentation. Are we talking about specifically cultural fragmentation in terms only of the narratives of the nation? Are you talking about something more social, economic? I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ronnie. You want to take maybe also the question by Daniel?
Yeah, let's combine.
Go.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Hi, Daniel. Yeah, thank you.
I suppose my question is also related to the kind of theoretical underpinnings of what you're trying to do, and perhaps to situate it within some of the debates, people may be more familiar with, say, modernism, primordialism. So thinking, okay, your definition of the nation is fairly uncontroversial, I would agree, but that will still leave questions of what the difference between the nation and nationality somewhat undefined. And then some people would say modern nations more often than not would build on previous forms of nationalities, and it's the role of nationalism as a political identity or a political ideology that then triggers this development. I suppose I'm on the one hand trying to think about how you position your argument within the modernism, primordialism, or ethno-symbolism, whatever way you want to call it. But then the substantive purchase of that would be something like, well, are all groups equally able to see themselves and to define themselves as nations? Or can we say that there are certain groups of people, certain social identities that, given their historical trajectories, given their struggles, given their commonalities, have proved to be more likely to turn into fully fledged nations? I want to kind of push a little bit your sort of general definition along those grounds, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And yeah, 2 questions for you guys.
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah. So very briefly, in terms of ethno-symbolism, primordialism, and constructivism, let's say, the attempt we make in the book is to fold these debates within, obviously, our questions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a framework, right? Because these are key debates. And in our perspective, this can be, it manifests itself either in the ascriptiveness or the thickness in particular dimensions. So if you think of the ethnic civic divide, let's say, as a continuum on an ascriptiveness axis, then that's the way we try to propose as a way forward. That's what we're trying to propose as a way forward. That in a way, the debate that you already know, that many people have said, well, every nation, even the ones that are built on civic identities, after a few years or decades or 100 years or 200 years, they end up manifesting ethnic kind of or ethnicized, reified elements. And all the ethnic, ethnically defined nation states obviously have civic elements as well, right? So it's a matter of degree rather than a matter of either or. I believe, at least. I don't know if Maya believes, but that's how we've tried to address that. Thickness is related, but not exactly getting to that. It's an attempt to provide another dimension that kind of captures if you want, the stickiness of the identity, or the thickness, as it says itself, or the density of how many markers are there. They don't have to be, though, ethnic or civic markers. It could be either, right? So thickness is about layering rather than the ethnic or civic divide that you were talking about. Now, you also talked about something that we are covering in the groupness part, right? Some groups may have more an easier time than others. That may or may not be true. That is linked to our first question: does a national community exist? And many national communities, as you very well know, didn't make, well, many communities didn't make it into national communities, right? And I don't mean by that aspiring stateless groups, but I mean by that groups that had a sense of groupness. There were other ethnic groups or other types of groups pre-modern times that they didn't make it into national movements, meaning their leaders or their members never asked for primary loyalty to a particular nation and so on and so forth, right? So there is no doubt that there is variation, and that's the type of variation we encourage people to look into in the future, and many people have done it, but not within our framework, of course. Now, do you want to take Ronnie's question, or should I take a stab at it as well, and then you do your own? Yeah. So, in terms of measurement, we toyed with the idea of actually becoming much more specific on measurement issues, but obviously there have been a lot of existing programs, research programs out there. So Cellway has looked at different cleavage structures and cross-cutting cleavages and so on and so forth. Many people, in other words, have moved beyond, the very basic atlas of the Soviet Union period with ethnic diversity capturing fragmentation, which then was called ethno-linguistic fragmentation. That's not what we mean here. Although that could be a proxy for what we're talking about, it's not the thing we're talking about, right? So you can approximate fragmentation in different contexts with these measures only insofar as those measures are capturing significant variation along the constitutive story of the country at hand. So what do we mean by that? If a country has a constitutive story going to I'm going to try to connect Daniel's and Ronnie's questions together. If there is a country that is ethnically defined, or what we call really high on ascriptiveness, then having the atlas data is quite meaningful. The atlas, the Soviet atlas data may be meaningful because the people in that country, the elites and the individuals, the non-elites, to go to Marco's point, are finding linguistic, religious, or cultural differentiation of groups as important politically. But if the ascriptiveness is really low in a country, having any measure of ethno-linguistic fractionalization is meaningless, because that's not the way that that community is defining itself, right? So when we talk about fragmentation, it's always connected to how the understanding, that's why Maya talked about Pakistan and India by going back to the 1850s. We need to first know what's the constitutive story or the competing constitutive stories if there is a lit fragmentation, right? A lit fragmentation basically could be substituted by competing narratives existing at the elite level, right? And popular fragmentation could mean that there is a lot of people who follow different elites, or that there are groups of people who are non-elite groups that are trying to push for a particular narrative, right? And of course, in the process, there will be potentially an elite that represents that movement, right? There is really very little that can be done at the nationalism level without elites ultimately, I have to say, and to make Marco a little bit more sad that that's my perspective, maybe Mike disagrees, because ultimately nationalism and nations are about big collectives. And really, you cannot have a group achieving or passing the threshold for us to consider it a potential national community, right, without any level of organization that involves elites. You see what I'm saying? But that doesn't mean that individual or grassroots developments don't mean anything, because that's where the elites come from often, right? From when the movement is popular, a popular movement. But ultimately, at some point, elites will, if we're going to study it, in other words, at some point, the elites had something to do with it. But that doesn't mean that the whole process was an elite process. Is that making sense?
Thank you, Harris. Time for Maya.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. There are just a few additional points I wanted to make. So there's, I think a real contribution of the book here is to kind of bring together a lot of different literature that hasn't traditionally spoken to one another. So, you know, this primordialism versus modernism debate that Daniel asked us about, I mean, that was the mainstay of nationalism research for many, many decades. And, you know, I think now there's a recognition that, as it were, most nations have a belly button, but they don't, you know, that there are nations without belly buttons. If you look across, that's also quite clear. And there's very, I think, clear empirical research that shows that, for example, in the case of Estonia. So I think that literature is moving. So we do discuss that in the chapter. You know, here's what the literature has kind of said in the past, and here's where the literature is going. It's going to say what are the consequences of nationalism, and to do that, you have to know. And this links to Ronnie's point. How do you think about different kinds of nationalisms, and how do you measure them? I think it's an interesting question, Daniel, that you raised. Are all groups equally able to call themselves nationalists? I mean, I think that they're quite clearly the answer to that question is no, right? Because some groups are more territorially concentrated. Some groups have shared language, and that facilitates it. Some groups are up against a much more well-organized and capacious central state. So lots of things influence whether groups are successful in calling themselves nations, and we don't make a claim here as to what makes that more and less likely. So just finally, to Ronnie's point, you know, how do we think about measuring it? So Harris and I both have kind of deep knowledge of particular countries and those particular founding moments. And to our knowledge, there aren't really good databases that capture some of the variation that we are talking about. So for example, in the Indian founding narrative, there is elite fragmentation to some degree around the question of whether Hinduism should define the nation. It doesn't fragment really strongly because those groups are a much smaller proportion of the overall elite at the moment of independence. But I wouldn't know even a database that captures that, right? Because it requires not looking at it starting with a database, but thinking about what do we see on the ground. And what you see is that elites are mostly quite cohesive through the glue of the anti-colonial struggle. And because that glue has been active for 3 decades by the time that independence comes. I don't even know how you would actually measure that in a consistent cross-national and time series way. But we know that it's there for certain cases. And you know, I had actually a friend read this, and she said, this cries out for measurement. And he said, great, that is not what we're not aiming to do that here. We're aiming to say, here's where we see a lot of this scholarship coming together and actually talking about very similar kinds of things along these 5 dimensions.
Yeah, thank you, Harris. Thank you, Maya. Any other comments or questions? We still have some minutes left.
While we're waiting, just to add that we do point in the other contribution of the book, we kind of didn't mention the contributions, but I guess we thought they would emanate from our discussion. But another contribution is that we do summarize, but also cite, of course, and reference really important works that do some of that in certain cases. So around her and her work on these issues does quantify in a particular way. So different people quantify this and try to measure this at in particular cases, as Maya said, and we have done that ourselves in other cases. But a cross-national attempt is difficult, primarily because I'll double down on that, primarily because it would need to take into account the narrative that somehow people don't like to emphasize, but the national narrative or narratives that exist in a country, competing or not, and the degree of their competition or competitiveness is a critical antecedent thing that you need to take into account in order to understand any, you know, any other measure or the impact of any other measure of ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or other type of fragmentation. So that's, I think, where it becomes really difficult, because you cannot have, you would need to do it on a case-by-case basis in order to look at this interaction. So anyone who's using, just to put it bluntly, anyone who's using the ethno-linguistic functionalization index, and there are many people, both in econ and in political science, is maybe correctly using it in countries that have an ethno-cultural understanding, to use Brubaker's kind of language here, of nationhood, at least a tendency of that. But it's completely off in civically defined nation states. So that tells you a little bit about the error term there.
Thank you, Harris. If I may, so yeah, go ahead.
Can I add just one more thing, actually, that I think maybe germane here, very brief. You know, Harris, you mentioned in your response that we're moved beyond kind of a simple dichotomous understanding of civic versus ethnic nationalism. But at the same time, I would caution us, and I think the book does this, against throwing out civic versus ethnic entirely. The mistake of the historical literature was to think that this was a dichotomous variable, right? That this was essentially, you were either civic or you were ethnic. And much of the really innovative work in nationalism, I think of Roger Smith's work on you know, the U.S. national narrative, and some really great ethnographic work on India's national narrative. You know, it shows that even ethnic nations smuggle in civic characteristics and vice versa. So what we say is helpful is to think about ascriptiveness as a range, as a kind of scalar variable, because of course there are differences between, you know, a kind of a South African pre-apartheid or apartheid South Africa definition of nationalism, and a kind of, you know, Indonesian nationalism that embraces a kind of much more multi-religious view of the nation, and multi-racial as well. So I think there's it's kind of a bringing together of a lot of these different debates to say, here's where I think is some helpful middle ground, and also where the state of the art is in terms of new research coming out.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, but I have a question there. More than a question, maybe I don't know, something I would like to ask you. And please accept my apology, because I'm conscious that you are a political scientist. So and this question is more maybe a sociological one. But it seems to me that actually when you deal with a nation, all right, does the nation exist? Yes, it exists. Tick the box. Now we move forward. How do we move forward? We move forward in terms of understanding the varieties of nationalism. And so you move to a level that, for me, maybe engaging again with that literature on everyday nationhood is not maybe the most important one, particularly looking at, let's say, Western Europe. Whereas the big question is migration. And so it's no longer about going to nationalism, it's going back to the nation. Who is the nation? So is there anything in your own book, in your own theoretical conceptualization that actually engages as well with that dimension?
Yeah, totally. In the end of the book, we allude to it. We don't unpack it fully because that would require volumes, obviously. But we do say that, for example, different combinations along those dimensions would make a country more likely to have permissive immigration policies and make it more easy to integrate immigrants than in a country that has high ascriptiveness, let's say, in its national narrative, and high on thickness. That would be a country that is probably not very well suited for being an immigrant destination. Now, of course, immigrants themselves know that, and they try to go to, there is a selection mechanism, right? They try to go to countries that it's easier to integrate, but it's not always their choice if we're talking about refugees. So things get really complicated when you have to do with refugees and forced migrants versus economic migrants, right? And that's a distinction that, of course, is not 100% ironclad distinction, because sometimes being an economic migrant is because of life and death kind of situations at home, because you cannot make ends meet. But there is a distinction when it comes to how abrupt and how much lack of choice you have of where you're going to end up when you're a refugee or a forced migrant, right? So our book doesn't speak to the forced migrant part and economic immigrant distinction, but it does speak to the probability that a country will be first of all, permissive in terms of naturalization or naturalization and residency requirements, but also how likely it is to integrate people who are not of its own kind, in quotation marks, right? Which is what you alluded to. And
Thank
so
you,
those
Harris.
dimensions do fit. Yeah.
Thank you, Harris. Maya, do you have anything to add here? Or?
Yeah, again, just to be really brief, I know we're out of time, but Harris mentioned a little bit of what we do in the book. I think more generally that and this I think is actually, Marco, how we initially got in touch. There's a chapter that I wrote in the Liev Orgod and Ruud Koopman's book, which talked about the need for nations to actually have thick nationalism, and the idea of thick came in part from us thinking in this book about thickness. But thickness that is ascriptive makes it especially hard for immigrants to integrate, because and there's been some excellent research on this. So there's been a really interesting piece that I can send the citation for, but essentially asks individuals who are, so it's Canadian Chinese compared with Dutch Chinese or Chinese Dutch. That is immigrants of Chinese origin in Canada versus the Netherlands. And they say, who are the groups that you most compare yourself to? And in the case of Canada, they say it's the real Chinese. And so they're comparing their most salient outgroups are Chinese, and that suggests a higher degree of integration in Canada than in the Netherlands, where the most salient outgroup are the real Dutch. And that suggests that there are kind of some sort of ascriptive definition of the Dutch nation, now it's maybe more implicit than it is explicit, but it's nonetheless felt. And, I think there's some interesting debates there to be had about, and Frank Fukuyama, I think himself says in his identity book that nations, that the European nations haven't grappled with their ascriptive origins to actually set up kind of more national identities that allow for the easier absorption of immigrants in the way that has been historically easier for Canada and the United States, simply because the founding narratives of the nation were less ascriptive, at least vis-a-vis the non-black and white boundary. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Maya. I guess we reached the time also, so let me thank again Maya and Harris for being our guests tonight. Let me thank everybody that joined us tonight. People that missed the talk, it will be posted on the LUNN website. So thank you again and have a great evening, if it's an evening, or a day, if the day is going to start in your own country.
Thank you for having us. Read the book, an assignment.
We will. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.